The best news that a man could ever hear is that God has forgiven him. The worst news that a man could ever hear is that God will never forgive him. Today we're looking at 3 questions. Number 1, is there a sin that God will never forgive? Number 2, if so, what is that sin? And if there isn't, then why did Jesus say that there is? And then number 3, is it possible for me to commit a sin that God will never forgive? We're looking at Mark chapter 3, verses 28 and 29, where Jesus said to the Pharisees, I tell you the truth, that all the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin. Hey, if accurate biblical truth is important to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, concerning the unforgivable sin or the unpardonable sin or blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, there are 3 typical views. By the way, I would love to hear what your understanding of this sin is. Whether it's forgivable, whether it's not forgivable, whether we can commit it today, not commit it today. Take a minute sometime during this video and give me your thoughts in the comment section below. One view says that the unforgivable sin is the continual rejection of the free offer of salvation through Christ. In other words, it is the rejection of the Holy Spirit until death, which would make death the only thing that puts a person beyond forgiveness. Now that sounds reasonable, and it even sounds biblical. However, we have to take into account a couple of other verses. One is in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 32, that whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or the age to come. Here I think that Jesus totally removes the possibility of forgiveness, not only after death in the age to come, but prior to death in the present age. And then John teaches us in 1 John that there is a sin unto death, which is pointless to even pray about. So, view 1 teaches you that you can be forgiven of any sin up to the point of death, and after death, there's no hope. A second view teaches that the unforgivable sin was a specific sin to the Pharisee situation and is something that cannot be duplicated today. And what scholars mean by this is that the Pharisees had Jesus standing right there in front of them, and they saw with their own eyes all the miracles that he did, and then they said, by the prince of demons, he's driving out demons. So they watched the miracles firsthand, and then they denied the power of Christ and said that it was Satan. So theologians say that that is a unique situation that cannot be duplicated because we don't have Christ physically in front of us, and we don't see those miracles being taken place firsthand. Therefore, the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is not a sin that one can commit today. And now, to be honest with you, this is the view that I adopted for many years. But since revisiting this question and studying just a bit deeper, I'm not so sure it's accurate, and here's why. View number 3. In verse 29, Jesus clearly says, whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. Notice what Jesus does not say here. He does not say that the Pharisees are guilty. He just says that whoever is guilty will not be forgiven. Second, Jesus explicitly says that the person who does blaspheme the Holy Spirit, God will never forgive them. And third, Jesus refers to this particular sin as an eternal sin, which is a sin that God will never forgive. Now, Jesus doesn't mince his words. Take a look at the scene from another perspective in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 32, where Jesus himself says that anyone who speaks a word against the Son of God will be forgiven. But anyone who speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. So it seems to me that one can reject, he can blaspheme, he can shake his fist in the face of Christ and in the face of God the Father and say whatever you want to say about them, and he will be forgiven. But once we start blaspheming the Holy Spirit, that sin, for some reason, will never be forgiven. Now, this is just one of several verses that raise the question of unforgivable sins. You find it in Numbers, you find it in Hebrews, you find it in John, and I'll put all of those in the description below. Now, these texts, I know, they don't mention blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, but they do raise the uncomfortable prospect of a sin that cannot be forgiven. Now let's take another look at the text in Mark chapter 3, verse 28. Jesus says, "All sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter." In Matthew 12, he says, "Whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven," as noted earlier. Then in verse 29 of Mark 3, he says, "Whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness." Now, Jesus seems to identify two things here. Number one, he identifies blasphemy. And then he identifies the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now here's the difference. To blaspheme is to intentionally and openly speak evil against God, the church, or spiritual things. To blaspheme against the Holy Spirit is a little bit different. Now I have 8 different theological dictionaries with definitions in the description below. But combined, they agree that the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is the verbal, persistent, deliberate rejection of the Lord's work and crediting Satan with it. Now, I say it is a verbal, persistent rejection because of verse 30. Verse 30 records the words like this: "They were saying." Now that phrase is in the progressive voice, which means it is an ongoing, continuous action. So, crediting the work of God to Satan was not a one-time event. These Pharisees were so hardened against Christ that they continued to associate him and his work with Satan. Now make sure that you understand this. Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is not the occasional bad thought or anger against God that we've all experienced at one time or another. Those are sins for sure, but they're not the persistent, deliberate rejection of Christ and giving Satan credit for the miracles like the Pharisees did. That is blasphemy. That is unforgivable. Now think about this. I don't think it's unforgivable because the Lord is not willing to forgive. It's unforgivable because the person has fully and finally hardened his heart to the point that he won't ask for forgiveness. Now, those who have been fully exposed to the truth of the gospel and yet walk away from Christ in spite of the overwhelming evidence that they have been given are those who